Welcome to Checks and Balances, the takeover. I'm Makayla,
And I'm Jess.
and today we're talking about when is it too young to buy a house?
Everybody in New Zealand is obsessed with property. I think it goes without saying, buying a house is seen as a massive, massive milestone for a lot of Kiwis. So the question we're posing today is younger better? Is sooner the better, yes or no?
Yeah, I feel like it's a question I see actually asked a lot on Reddit. So there's a personal finance New Zealand subreddit, and like there's a lot of people in there that are super financially switched on. And I often see people in that like 20 to 25 age range, and they've saved up enough funds for a deposit, but they're like, is that the right thing for me to do? I've got the money, but should I do it?
And so they're kind of at that age where it's going, because what are the other options? Like, are they saying, is it the right thing or do I do what?
Yeah,
What's the
so
other?
like, or do I go overseas, or do I invest it, or what
Mm.
should I do?
So that's why today we're talking about the pros and cons of buying young and whether topping up a mortgage at age 22 is really the dream.
Yeah, I don't know if that would be my dream at 22.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't mine. So let's get into it.
So as of 2024, home ownership rates in New Zealand were 67% of New Zealand households own the home they live in, which I feel like that's quite decent actually.
I thought it was low,
Oh,
interestingly. I
interestingly.
thought it would be higher, but maybe it depends on who the circles of people that you associate with, what they
Potentially.
focus on.
So
maybe.
the average age of a first home buyer currently is around 36 years old, which
Yeah.
to me that is like the age I would think about buying a home at, but to a lot of people they're thinking about it younger.
Absolutely. Yeah, I sort of feel like I'm 34 now, and a lot of my friends have already bought, and it was a big focus even through my 20s. So 36 again felt like quite high to me. I thought it was going to be younger.
Yeah, I feel like with the age 36 that makes sense to me, but the conversation is getting younger and younger. Like even in our office we have heaps of people under 25 that have already purchased a property. So like
Yeah,
people are thinking about it sooner.
colleagues and clients. It's
Mhm.
it's both. And so, yeah, if you're sort of thinking when I was overseas, and in Europe, it's weird because you come from a background in New Zealand where the home ownership piece is such a focus, and you kind of just always assume I will own a house at some point. Like that is my journey.
Yeah.
Whereas you go to Europe and you sort of travel around and think, oh my gosh, people are actually renting long term. They're kind of in different buildings as well. It's apartment buildings up high, and their plan long term is to rent. It's not even on their radar to buy a house. So it's a completely different mindset over there. And in a way, you sort of think, well, land ownership is a cultural thing. So some people think of that as like, I'm just here in this space for the space of time that
Mhm.
I'm here. I don't actually feel the need to own the patch of dirt that I live on.
Mhm.
So it's just a totally different mindset.
Yeah, I think even like for me, where I've lived in the town I grew up in, I would say it wasn't very normal to own a home like until you
Hmm.
were in your 30s thinking about having a family. However, for a brief while, I lived in a smaller town that had a really big industry, which was like aluminum smelting. And but people there were getting paid massive salaries like right out of high school. So if you didn't own a house by the age of like 23, you were
Embarrassing.
weird.
Yeah, well, let's get into some stats. So, global renting trends, if we're looking at countries like Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Denmark, so all quite Euro focused, but Switzerland is actually the highest global rate of renting at 57% of the population.
I wonder, I feel like people in Switzerland are like really chill and not stressed about stuff. So maybe they just don't stress over home ownership.
Or is it because it's so expensive?
Ooh,
Maybe.
good point.
Switzerland's an expensive place to be. Germany as well, around half of their residents rent.
So renting is great. People do it all over the world. People do it here, but Kiwis want to focus on buying property because that's what we love. We
Yeah.
love. Ooh, am I a Kiwi now?
Yeah, of course you are. Royal we.
So there's some incentives here for first home buyers, and there's also been some recent changes which might incentivize people to look at buying younger.
Yeah, so the recent KiwiSaver changes are centered a little bit around the younger people. So quite often when we're talking to clients about KiwiSaver for their kids, we go, do you know what? There's not actually a huge amount of benefit to locking up money in KiwiSaver. when they're young and they're not working. Now we're looking at 16 and 17-year-olds are eligible for those government contributions. So the government are taking steps to incentivize people saving younger. And then, of course, you can get the employer contributions. I was certainly working from sort of 14, 15. So I would have been getting the employer contributions as well. And as we all know, we can use that money for a first home deposit. So there's kind of that quite clear runway built into the way we do things in New Zealand to buy a first home.
Yeah, so there is a clear roadmap for people to get there. But at the same time, I feel like we have to address the fact that it's just really expensive to live in New Zealand. So you might be a super saver from 16 onwards, but the market's still really hard to get into. But I think that this will open it up for people, that have been really good savers or maybe have some help from Bank of Mum and Dad as well to get in a little bit earlier.
This is why it's important to talk about, right? Because it is such a big decision. If you're in your early 20s and you've saved up this chunk of cash, do I want to tie it up in property and commit to that type of life from now, or are there other things that are priority for me? So what about the lending incentives on that side of things?
Yeah, so lending incentives, obviously last year we lost the first home grant, which was kind of sad, RIP the first home grant.
Yeah.
But we still have the first home loan, which is another incentive to help you get in. So you can get loans with a 5% deposit, a 10% deposit. You don't necessarily need that 20% if you hit all the criteria there.
But the result, so if you've saved up your money and you're getting this KO support, the result is that quite a young person is taking on quite a large amount of debt.
Yes.
And we've talked about financial education on this podcast before, and it's sort of been lacking up until recently where they're introducing it in schools, but do early 20-year-olds understand the implications of the debt that they're taking on, and are they going to be better or worse off?
Yeah.
And I think we're going to get to this conclusion, but I think actually at the end of the day, it kind of just depends. Depends on the person, depends on your goals. And people get really annoyed when you give that answer. They're like, typical financial advisor, the answer is always, it depends. But it's because it's true. Yeah, it's true. It totally depends on you, your lens, your values, your worldview as to what's appropriate for you. So let's get into that.
Yep. So we will go over some pros and cons, but first we'll take a little break.
You're working towards buying your first home. It's really important that you've reviewed your KiwiSaver fund and provider. You need a fund that's at the appropriate risk level for where you're at. Get in touch with us. We can give you KiwiSaver advice. Use the link in the show notes below. Now back to the episode.
Okay, Jess, lay the pros and cons on me. Should I be buying a house in my 20s?
Well, there's a lot of both, right? So if we're thinking about, let's think of the good news first. The good news is,
I like good news.
Yes. You're building equity earlier. So people that bought a house 10 years ago have built 10 years worth of capital gain value in their home. They've been paying down debt in the meantime, and it's left them in a pretty good position. So from that perspective, and we tell people this all the time, they kind of go, I'm thinking about buying a house next year. And you're like, why are you waiting a year? Do
what
it
is
now.
that James says?
Time
in the market versus
not timing. Exactly. So just do it now. If that's part of your goals and your vision for yourself, why are we waiting a year? Just crack on. So that's point one. Locking in housing costs versus rising rents. So typically speaking, the cost of rent outpaces inflation. So meaning that if you plan to rent over the long term we're talking, that can have implications on your overall financial position. So getting your house, your little patch of land locked in as of today's values can be beneficial in that sense. And I think that's probably another episode we're going to return to maybe later. The other thing is that you're accessing all of these incentives while they're available. So we know from the first home grant being cut that, people that bought prior to that have benefited from free money from the government, which who doesn't love that? And now we don't have it. So, some of these benefits might not be available if you're pushing things out 5 and 10 years. Rules and laws are going to change in that time.
Yeah, I agree. And especially if you're listening to this right now and you feel like, I know this is something I want to do and I think I'm ready. It's always a good time to buy, but especially now, there's a lot of stock on the market. There's a lot of things to look at. There's incentives available. So don't wait. Like you said, take the action.
It's a buyer's market right now. Yeah. So those are all the positives.
Okay. So cons, less flexibility. I actually think this is a massive one in your 20s because yes, you have the asset, but like you said at the very beginning, is topping up a mortgage something you want to do? Because presumably in your 20s, you're going to be thinking about like, where do you actually want to live? Maybe you want to travel a bit. Maybe you want to like circulate cities till you find one that works for you. So unless you're actually planning on living in that house, you may be dealing with having to have a tenant in there and like topping up the
Managing it.
costs in between,
Yeah.
managing it.
Yeah.
That's a lot to think about when you're trying to live the best years of your life.
For sure. And this is such a common conversation that we have. A lot of people, this is getting deep, but a lot of people don't even really know themselves until they get into their late 20s and you've lived a bit of life.
I agree.
And you know what you like and you don't like.
Yeah.
You think back to when you're 21 and 22 versus you're 30. You hit 30s, you're actually quite a different person. And some people from a really young age have that clear, I know I want to be in New Zealand. I know I want to settle in and have a family ASAP. But I'd say probably the majority of people now are sort of not as sure or wanting to explore different options before they lock something in.
Yeah.
So that flexibility and lifestyle is a massive con, I think, in your 20s.
Yeah, I agree. And that also leads into the other ones, which is, potentially missing out on shared experiences. I know in New Zealand, the OE is a big thing.
Why do you say it like that?
This is not something I knew about before I moved here.
Really?
Coming from a huge country, like, I don't know, you just kind of live in
chill.
that country.
Yeah,
but I guess it's so small over here. You're like, let me out of here.
Oh, we're so
go.
isolated. We're so far away that spending time overseas is for me, it was a huge priority. So hypothetically, you've saved up a bunch of money. Say you've gone to uni, you've done your training and trade or whatever it is. You've gone into work maybe for a little bit. You've built up some savings. You're sitting on this chunk of cash and you've got a couple of options. You go, do I lock in a property in New Zealand and buy that? Do I travel overseas or do I rent and hop around New Zealand and decide where I actually want to be? And that OE thing, I think, if you're doing that later in life, the type of experience that you have is not the same as what you have in your 20s. Like, it's quite character building.
Maybe you're old and you just want to like sleep in. I don't know. The next one I feel like is really big too is the risk of your job. So I wouldn't say for most people in the early stage of your 20s, you're quite like locked into a career path. So you might have a lot of fluctuations with your work. And now you have a mortgage to pay. So, it's not something like potentially you're renting and then you hit a wall and you're like, Mom and Dad, I've got to move in with you. The mortgage isn't going anywhere. You can't just cease that. So you really need to think about like, I'm taking on a massive cost and I have to be able to pay for that cost on an ongoing basis.
Huge responsibility. What do they say? Gets you out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
In a depressing way.
What gets you out of bed in the morning.
Yeah. So a couple of cons there. And I do feel like if you are super clear on your pathway forward, you know where you want to be and you want to lock in a house and a property, that's fantastic for you. But if you're on the fence, like if it's not a heck yes, it's a no.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
I
Like
agree.
if you're on the fence, then maybe just see where life leads you a little bit before locking in that massive, massive responsibility.
Yeah. I feel like there's one more thing we need to touch on, which I don't know if this is a con more than just like a cautionary tale.
Oh.
But we also need to think about the people that are in relationships in their 20s and they're going, well, me and my significant other have a combined house deposit. Why don't we just buy a deposit? Why don't we just buy a house? I mean, listen, we're not here to give relationship advice. However, locking yourself into an asset with another person, maybe it's not even a romantic partner. It could be like a friend. I do know, like I have friends that bought houses in their younger days with just a mate and ended up having to sell it because they wanted to do different things in their, 25 to 30 age range.
Yeah.
Life changes. Exactly. So that's something you really need to consider if you're not just thinking about doing it on your own, but you're thinking about doing it with another person.
Definitely. Yeah. A lot of things change in your 20s and relationships and friends that might have made sense in your early 20s might not make sense in 5 and 10 years. Put it that way.
100%. Okay, what other ways can we look at building wealth in the 20s? Because obviously people are listening to this and maybe they're going, oh, maybe I don't want to buy a house now. What else can I do?
What else can I do? Yeah. I think, if your focus isn't going to be on experiences and say doing the OE and doing things like that, you do want to be setting aside some money to build build wealth for an eventual potential house purchase, there's a couple of options. Of course, utilizing the benefits of KiwiSaver. So your contributions, government contributions, make sure you're building up that pot nicely for your deposit in the future. Speaking to somebody, a KiwiSaver advisor, about the correct risk level for your situation. If you're talking 10 years or more away, then we can take a little bit more risk with your investment. If you are talking within 1 or 2 years, then actually we're going to be taking very, very little risk. So it depends on the timeline. And if you do speak to someone about this, it's great to go into that conversation with just a brainstorm, a rough idea of how long it might take you to get to that point where you might feel ready. So, using KiwiSaver, as a really good rule of thumb, if you're trying to achieve a goal within sort of the 3 year time frame, I wouldn't be exposing your savings to much volatility. So investing in shares is not a short-term solution. Investing in shares is a long-term game. So bearing all these things in mind, coming back to your time frame, your risk, risk appetite and things like that before you make a decision of where to put your money.
I feel like also if you're going to be doing, I'm going to go do the overseas thing, being conscious of like sticking to a budget so that you don't just deplete the savings you've got, and maybe thinking about, are you earning any income while you're traveling? Can you put a little bit of that aside to keep the momentum going while you're still enjoying yourself?
Yeah, finding a bit of a balance there.
Hmm.
The other thing that we always talk about is the income growth as being quite important in our 20s. So that can really help. People really, really underestimate, and they go through the financial planning process with us and go, oh my goodness, they'll come back for a review and go, I got a 5 or 10 grand pay rise, and we'll put that through the projections, and they go, whoa, I can retire so much sooner. Like, you actually underestimate the difference that increasing your income has. Obviously, more money is always good, but people don't realize how impactful it is.
Yeah.
So how do people grow their income in their 20s?
Yeah, which don't be afraid to do. Don't ask, don't get.
Yeah. And there's different things you can do. Education, career pivots. I know a lot of people that have done that kind of thought, when I was 18 and deciding what to do, I liked this one thing, and actually I'm now 24, 25, and I know myself a little better and I'm better suited to this pathway, or I can see how lucrative that's going to be if I pivot now. So don't be afraid to do that, because over the long term it will pay off. What about talking to your manager about promotions, pay rises?
Something you should do. I mean, like I just said, don't ask, don't get. It can be a really jarring conversation, but you are your biggest asset at the end of the day. And like, back yourself. If you think you're worth it, go for it.
What can I be doing if I'm not hitting my KPIs? What can I be doing better?
Yeah, how
what
can I get there?
Yeah, asking those questions is really important as well.
Yeah, for me, I feel like I'm glad that I didn't actually, I have to say I did buy a house in my 20s, but I sold it.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that I didn't carry through that asset, because my life actually changed so much. Like, I thought I'd be living in small town Canada forever, and I'm in New Zealand. But I feel like if I had that would have been a bit of a hindrance to like figuring out how I'm going to move overseas and how I'm going to deal with that. And I've seen that with clients as well that have come from overseas, and it's like, oh, what do I do about this house I have back home? And like, yes, it would be great to have the equity and all that, but I probably wouldn't have had the freedom to make the choices I did.
Yes, and I think this actually comes back to something we say in client meetings all the time, because people are sort of focused on, how do I make the most money? Like, what's the best financial decision for me? And like, coming back to what is money for, it just helps us live the life that we want to live. And your happiness, although more money does help, is actually more tied to what you're doing with that money. So I think the conclusion is, yes, buying a house early is great if that's what you want and you're clear on that and you understand the responsibility. It's a great way to start to build wealth over time. But if you're not going to be happy in that situation, like, there's more to it than the money. Like, you have to think about, is this actually going to make me happy in the long term? Because if you were still in small town Canada, would you be happy?
Absolutely not.
There's more to it than that. It's not a simple black and white yes or no, what's going to make me more money or not. So I think that's where I come from with it, is it depends on you and your situation, and that's not a really clear-cut answer, but something for you to think about.
And I think I also have to add as a last thought, despite what Kiwis say, property is not the be all end all of wealth.
Agreed. Well, thanks so much for listening to today's episode. Thank you to Lighthouse Financial for sponsoring us. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.